Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to the Scary Stories NYC Scary Saturday Serials Complete Saga, Chapter 3, entitled Alone with the Dogman. This chapter comes after Chapter 2, entitled Mom Said Werewolves Aren't Real, and before Chapter 4, called Dogman versus the Werewolf. Let's get right back into the narrative. Now, sit back, kick your shoes off, dim the lights, and don't chew that popcorn too loud as the story of Life with Dogman continues. I heard the sound behind me, or the sounds, I should say. I didn't have to look, but I did anyway, and my eyes confirmed it. There were two of them, two angry dogmen, both the same height as I was. They appeared like evil border collies with human-like arms, standing behind some bushes, glaring at me. I did what any red-blooded, brave young American would do. I screamed like a 3-year-old and ran away from them. I started shouting, "Mad dogs! Mad dogs! Everybody out of here!" and was surprised and grateful when Marsha joined me. People began running for their cars and shouting. I don't know if any of them saw the dogmen, or if we had just spooked them, but they screamed, and they ran. Marsha and I looked around and saw that the chaos seemed to have also scared the dogmen off, so we sort of killed two birds with one stone. Relieved, we both laughed and hugged each other. "So, you think this is funny, do you?" came the stern voice to my left. That was my mother's voice. "Answer your mother," came the order from my right. That voice would belong to Dad. Within an hour, Marsha's parents were over our house, and all four of the parents were arguing over whether it was me driving Marsha insane, or if it was Marsha humoring my fantasies that was driving me insane. But the end result was the same. We both were banned from seeing each other for the rest of the summer. Now these days, that wouldn't be quite as bad, since everyone has their own telephone, plus there's the internet, and therefore lots of ways to get around this sort of a ban. Back in those days, though, our family had one landline, which we shared. We had no cell phones and no computers. Not being allowed to see each other meant we couldn't communicate. If we sent mail, like snail mail, the parents would intercept it and likely destroy it after reading it themselves. We were completely locked away from each other until one day I got a phone call from my friend Phil. I wasn't that close with him, but he had joined me and some of my friends going to a ball game once, and we had exchanged phone numbers on that day. Still, neither of us had ever called the other before, so I was confused when my mother told me I had a call from Phil. I took it up in my room, and Phil said hi, then told me someone needed to speak to me. It was Marsha. We caught up on old times, and she said I should find out when my parents were going to be out of the house and let Phil know. He would pass the info on to her, then she could go over to his place to call me sometimes. I asked why it had to be when my parents weren't home, and she said it was because of my mother's habit of sometimes picking up the receiver to see if I was still on a phone call or if she could use the phone yet. Like I said before, We only had one telephone for the entire family back in those days. So Marsha and I had our plan with Phil, and we executed it a few times, managing to keep in touch in spite of our evil overlords imprisoning us both in this way. Then, one night, my mom told me Phil was on the phone, and I was just as confused as the first time he had called me. This wasn't how the plan was supposed to work. I took the call in my room, and Phil sounded really weirded out. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that Marsha had just called him. She sounded really upset. I asked him why, and he said she told him to tell me that there was a dogman stalking her house. At first my heart raced. Then I wondered if Phil was pulling some kind of a prank on me. "Are you serious?" I asked, "because I'll bop you on the noggin if you're lying." He said it was for real, and she sounded like she was crying, but I reminded him that Marsha and her family lived much further into town than my family did. She had a backyard, it had trees in it, but for a dogman to get all the way over to her place, it would need to have to stroll down streets with houses on them. I couldn't imagine any way it could get over there without being seen and causing a big ruckus. Phil said he didn't understand what I was saying, but all he knew was that if I didn't head over there to help her, then he was going to go do it. Now that really annoyed me. First, he had my girlfriend over at his place all the time. Now he's criticizing how I treat her. I hung up on him and tried to figure out how to get over to Marsha's without my parents knowing that I was leaving. I went out of my room and looked over the edge of the stairwell banister. I could hear that they were watching TV, so that meant they were distracted. I would have to walk past them to get out, and they would see me. If I came up with a good enough excuse, then I could possibly leave, but my dad would want to drive me to any place I said I was going. Even if I could sneak out somehow, if I got caught, then they would know that Phil and I were up to something, and Phil would become the next person I wasn't allowed to talk to. I went back to my room and quietly let myself in again. Then I ran to my window. Could I get out that way? I leaned out and looked down. I would need to jump to the tree, and I wasn't sure I could actually make it because I wasn't Spider-Man. Even if I could, I would be climbing down the tree by the window behind the TV set. They would both see me the entire time I climbed down. I sat on my bed and wondered what I should do. I called Phil back and told him he was going to have to come get me. My parents would never let me out, but if he came over to pick me up, we might get away with it. He interrupted me mid-rant and told me that he had called Marsha and she had said not to come over. She told him she was going to get her father to go outside with her and search around, telling him that she thought she saw a burglar. Hopefully, their walking around would frighten the dogman off, but if not, then maybe her father would see it and finally understand that she and I were not crazy for saying we saw these same werewolf-type creatures at the party that day. I had to admit that was a pretty good plan and definitely worth a try. I figured it wouldn't actually work out because we had had such bad luck so far. Then, Phil asked me a question that really surprised me. He asked me what Dogman was code for. He didn't understand that we were actually talking about dogmen. He thought we were talking about something that we didn't want him to know about. I sort of liked that. He knew too much about us already as it was, so this cheered me up a bit. I told him, very seriously, that I would tell him eventually, but it was too soon for him to learn the big secret. Then I hung up the phone before he heard me laughing. I didn't laugh for long, though. as the realization that Marsha was going to be trying to walk around her house at night when she knew a dogman was right there and had been all night. I got a pain in the pit of my stomach and felt completely helpless, not knowing what was happening, not knowing if she was safe, and not knowing when I would find out anything about any of this. I sat by the phone all night waiting for news about Marsha. The later it got, the more I was convinced that something bad had happened. I decided I'd better try to sleep, or at least rest, but I would keep my clothes and shoes on in case I had some reason to go outside. I'm not sure exactly what I thought was going to happen, but I wanted to be prepared for all possible occurrences. At a little after 11:30 p.m., I woke up to the sound of ringing and grabbed the landline. There was a dial tone, so I thought I dreamed the ringing. Then it came again, and I understood that this was the bell to the front door ringing, not the telephone. I got up to run downstairs, but my father was blocking my way and shouting at whoever it was that he was coming. He tied his bathrobe shut and strolled to the front door. When he threw it open, I couldn't see who was out there, but my father didn't look too happy to see whoever it was. I was watching a movie on TV, so this better be good, he grumbled. By this point, I had reached the front door. I was surprised to see Marsha's dad out there, but even more surprised to see Marsha herself. She and I caught each other's eyes. She gave me an expression of victory, then tore her gaze away and focused entirely on her father, who asked to be let inside. My dad almost invited them in, then paused and asked again what this was about. He wanted to be convinced before he would let them in. To be honest, he said, I'd rather go back to watching my movie. Can't you state your case right where you're standing? Marsha's father rolled his eyes at the rudeness and mumbled something sarcastic about what a positive role model my dad was. He saw one of them, Marsha blurted out, at first making eye contact with my dad and then with me. He saw one of the dogmen, she exclaimed triumphantly. Well, no, I didn't say that exactly, her dad interrupted. All I said was that I saw something that I could understand these two kids interpreting as a dogman. Well, what was it if it wasn't a dogman? Marsha asked in an annoyed way. My father shushed them both and brought them inside, but didn't ask them to sit down. It's bad enough your daughter's trying to drive my son crazy, but now you're trying to do the same to me, Dad shouted. All I'm saying is that the kids did nothing wrong. We should end their punishment, insisted her dad. Soon, my mother had come downstairs, and the three of them got into one of those huge parent fights, with each of them saying meaner stuff than the last one. Marsha and I walked right out the front door and closed it behind us quietly. None of them even noticed. Where do you want to go? She asked me. Honestly, to another planet, I answered. Well, walk me to the White Castle then, she said. I hear their coffee is made of rocket fuel. We had a lot of catching up to do, and so we did. After getting some sodas, she wanted to tell me the story of how her father had been converted to our side. I dragged her out of the White Castle where we could have a little more privacy. Once we found a spot far enough away from everyone else, she began her story. Okay, I don't know if Phil told you, but I had seen one of your dogmen outside our house in the backyard. I told her I had gotten that message, and she went on. Okay, so I was supposed to take out the garbage, but there was no way I wanted to go out there alone. I told Dad there was a burglar or something like that outside, that I'd seen something moving in the shadows. He immediately assumed that it was you for some reason, and he got his baseball bat. Wait, I stopped her. Your dad thought it was me, and so he got his baseball bat? What was he going to do with it exactly? I don't know, she answered. Maybe he wanted to practice his bunting. Yeah, with my head, I responded. I couldn't believe this whole story, and we weren't even up to the mythological monster cryptid predator yet. So anyway, she continued, he went out first, looking around, and told me the coast was clear. I came out behind him with the garbage. I could tell Dad was actually more than a bit frightened by the way he was acting. He proceeded very cautiously toward the corner of the house. We needed to turn left, then walk down the path next to the trees over there, about halfway up the house to the front where we keep the trash cans. I reminded her that I hadn't been banned from her house long enough to have forgotten the place's layout, and she went on. Okay, so Dad turned the corner, and I thought I heard the sound of a woman screaming. My first thought was that people say Bigfoot sometimes can scream like a woman, and also mountain lions. Panicked, I ran around him to see what he was looking at, when I noticed that the woman's screaming was actually coming from my father. I would have laughed at him, but I followed his gaze, and there was the huge, dark form of the Dogman monster I had been seeing from the upstairs window. What did it look like? I asked. Well, she began. It was dark over there, and I couldn't make out that much detail, but it was very tall, taller than any of the ones I saw at your place. I could swear it had black fur, but like I said, it was dark. The eyes glowed in the dark, literally glowed like a firefly. This was all of great interest to me, as the tall and black Dogman was the first I had seen, and in fact, I'm pretty sure it might have saved me from being attacked by some of the more feral creatures that also seemed to live in the area. I kind of viewed the black one as more human-centric and less hostile to our kind than the others. Yet now, Marsha was telling me that this beast had somehow found its way very far from the woods my family lived by and into the heart of the local human population where Marsha lived. I couldn't even understand how it got there, let alone why it would have been there. What did it do? I asked anxiously. Did it hurt your dad? Did it threaten him? Oh, he threatened both of us just by being there, Marsha squealed. It was like it walked out of caveman times. A prehistoric, giant, upright walking canine standing a few feet in front of you in a tight spot? That's always going to be a threatening situation. So did you run? I asked. I wanted to, but Dad went into protective mode and started swinging his bat at the dog. Oh no, I said, that doesn't sound like a good idea. It worked though, she responded. The Dogman ran away from us, toward the front of the house and the sidewalk. That made sense to me, only if the Dogman they encountered was the friendlier one. Any of the others probably would have grabbed that bat away from her father and made him pay, but the one I had seen before would be more likely to try to avoid fighting with a human. A car horn beeped loudly, and both of us jumped a few inches in the air. I didn't recognize the car, but Marsha stood and ran toward it. I trotted after her and saw that it was both her parents together. She was leaning over into the window and talking to them out of my earshot. Then she got up and skipped over to me happily. "Come on, you're staying with us tonight," she exclaimed. "My dad says you can go home tomorrow and get your stuff and stay with us full-time from now on if you want." We'll be right back with the all-new chapter of Bryan's Lycan Troubles. Bryan's Lycan Troubles continue. Jenny realized too late how foolish she had been. She wanted to see Bryan so badly that she had wandered out to the tree line toward what anyone else on the planet would have interpreted as a threatening, monstrous shape. Her mind was exhausted, and her emotions as well. When she saw the silhouette in the woods, when she smelled that animal smell, she had assumed it was Bryan, that he had been drawn back to her via his nature. She was still young and romantic, and still believed in happy endings. But now, upon realizing that thing in front of her was not her husband, but was in fact a Lycan or Dogman or werewolf or something, Jenny discovered tears were running down her cheeks. She might be approaching an ending, that was for sure, but it certainly did not seem like it would be a happy one. Backing away toward the house, she could hear the creature advancing toward her through the brush. Jenny turned and ran back to Laura's house. When she reached the door, she discovered in horror that she had locked herself out. Jenny reached down for the key, but she was wearing her pajamas and it wasn't there. Jenny looked toward the woods, which she had just run from, and saw it clearly for the first time. If a wolf could be a silverback, that might best describe what she was looking at. This was the most massive Dogman she had ever seen. Wait, that she had ever seen? Jenny wondered, why had she thought that? Had she seen Dogmen other than Bryan? Was this her recovering some of her lost memories? Had she seen this particular Dogman before? Did it know who she was? Might it be her friend? Jenny's mind spun in confusion. She stopped trying to get inside for a moment and looked the creature directly in its yellow, glowing eyes. Jenny found it burned to look into them, so she looked away and rubbed her eyes. From her right, she heard that thing begin to growl, and she knew her question had been answered. This was not her friend. Jenny banged on the house door and screamed at the top of her lungs until Laura finally came to answer. Opening the door, Laura wanted to say something, but she did not get a chance as Jenny rushed past her into the house and pushed the door shut, locking it herself. "We're in trouble," she told Laura. "Is there any place to hide in here?" Laura's eyes went wide as her brain registered what Jenny was saying. She had thought that Jenny was nice when she took her in, but she had never given any thought to what Jenny's friends or enemies might be like. Turning back to the front door, Laura gasped as she saw the thing walk right past her front window. It was not a man. It was an animal, and it was so tall that the tops of its dog ears on its massive dog head were too high for Laura to even see. Its chest was so wide, it filled the entire window as it walked past. "It's a walking dog," she told Jenny as though Jenny didn't know. "But it's a man. But it's a dog." Jenny said, I know. Is there a safe place in here that we can go? Get into the basement, Laura ordered. Jenny didn't have to be asked twice as she ran down the stairs and watched as Laura bolted the door behind them. Is there any other way in here from outside? Jenny asked, and Laura shook her head no. Just then, they heard glass breaking upstairs, and the two of them fell silent. The creature had very heavy footsteps for a dog, and Jenny wondered how much that thing must weigh. It must have seen them head for the basement, or else smelled them or something, because it made a beeline for the door to the basement and slammed hard into it. Already from the first try, you could tell that eventually that Dogman was probably going to break through. Laura grabbed Jenny and pulled her into a small, ancient washroom. She closed the door, but it didn't seem as though it would hold. It wasn't half the strength of the door to the basement. Jenny and Laura held each other, and they both cried, preparing to meet their maker. The monster upstairs went into a frenzy, destroying things. They could only imagine what by the sound each made when thrown or ripped apart. Laura suggested this might actually be a lucky break. She'd rather have her house torn apart than herself. Both of them realized they'd much rather deal with the loss of physical objects than the loss of their lives. They could hear the increasingly frustrated monster snorting and grunting, and at points it almost sounded like a bull. Jenny made a stupid face and imitated the monster's snorts and bellows quietly. Laura laughed while still crying. They might not survive through the night, but they weren't going to let that animal take their sense of humor and their sense of humanity from them. And then, as though it had run out of anything else to destroy, the monster upstairs seemed to remember about the door to the basement. It rammed into it hard, and neither of the women was laughing any longer. They went back to hugging, and they went back to crying. The Dogman slammed hard into the door a third time, and a fourth time. On the fifth time, they heard something cracking. Jenny and Laura both saw in their minds the door's wood cracking, or the wooden bar across it failing. Their hearts sank, and they knew the inevitable was about to arrive. But in the next instant, they heard the Dogman howl. It was a strange kind of a howl, definitely not one of triumph. In the next moments, they heard a sound much closer to a dog's whimpering, and they understood that on that last run at the door, the creature had hurt himself more than he had hurt the wood. The dog thing stayed around upstairs for a while, whining like someone's pet. Then it grew quiet upstairs, and they wondered if it had left. Laura woke Jenny up some time later, and Jenny hadn't even realized she'd fallen asleep. Laura said it had been 2 hours with no sounds. She said they could probably go upstairs and drag down a mattress to the basement so they could get some proper rest. Heading upstairs, it was as destroyed as you might expect. Laura tried the phone, intending to call her good cop brother, but the line had been ripped right out of the wall. There was glass and broken wood and pottery everywhere. Well, one good thing for you, young missy, said Laura. If we survive the night, my brother's gonna have to believe your crazy stories now. Jenny realized she now had a corroborating witness about the Dogman and wondered if it might be safe to tell Laura about Bryan. That Dogman must have had something to do with Bryan. Maybe it was his enemy. Maybe it was a Lycan, too. Maybe it knew who she really was. The two dragged a mattress downstairs with a blanket, and they talked deep into the night. Jenny spilled out all the details to Laura, and they didn't fall asleep until a little before dawn. The howling woke them up, and they both sat up in their makeshift bed. Looking around, they could see it was dark outside. Had they slept the entire day away, or was it storming outside? I never contacted my brother, Laura spoke out loud. We were supposed to drive in to see him today, but now it's nighttime already. I'm starving, Jenny suddenly realized. Better than being dead, honey, came the response. Upstairs, they could hear someone, or something, entering the house. It was something with very heavy footsteps. They looked at each other, and no words needed to be said. They both ran to the washroom and closed the door shut. From upstairs came a bellowing, unlike that of any animal that is supposed to exist on the surface of the planet Earth. Both of them shook in complete horror, holding each other tight. I just realized I'm not just hungry, Jenny said between sobs. What do you mean? Asked Laura. Jenny couldn't stop crying, but she tried to smile and laugh as she answered, Well, I have to go to the bathroom too. Bryan's Lycan troubles continue. Laura and Jenny cowered in the small room in the basement as the heavy-footed monster stomped across the floor above them. It wasted no time reaching the door to the basement and threw itself forcefully against the ever more fragile wooden boundary. Jenny wept as quietly as she could, and neither of them spoke about it, but they internally expected this night to end in an even worse way than the previous one. Suddenly, they could hear a second heavy-footed someone upstairs. There are two of them, whispered Laura in amazement. Two of them? Repeated Jenny, whose eyes suddenly went wide. She hoped that she knew who the second figure was. A horrible tumult erupted on the floor above them. It was even louder than it had been the night before. What could they be tearing up? Laura asked. There isn't anything left up there to destroy. They're not wrecking the place for fun, Jenny responded. They're fighting each other. Laura gave Jenny an odd look as she wondered about the conviction with which the younger woman uttered her statement. She seemed so certain that she knew what was happening. Laura wondered, how? Jenny stood up and said she wanted to look upstairs, but Laura pulled her down and held her down. You'll do no such thing. You'll get yourself killed, and me as well. The sounds of the fight above moved out of the house and grew more quiet. Now they're outside, Jenny shouted. Let me go. I have to see what's happening. She broke free from Laura's grasp and ran upstairs. Laura had little choice but to follow Jenny up the stairs. She had already decided that if she couldn't get the girl back downstairs, she was going to bolt the door and protect herself. Jenny flung the cellar door open wide and found the house trashed even worse than before, but there was no sign of who had created the mess. Then she heard sounds from outside and ran out the now broken front door and into the night. Laura watched her go in amazement, too tired to say anything to her at all. She began cautiously making her way to the kitchen to quiet her starving belly. Outside, Jenny saw two immense figures moving remarkably quickly around each other, apparently in battle. One was without doubt the huge silverback dogman she had witnessed and had been menaced by all the previous night. The other one also looked familiar, but she couldn't be certain. She wandered closer to the fight, so eager to find out if it was who she hoped it was, that she neglected to care for her own safety. There, under the moonlight, two oversized wolves fought savagely. The sounds they made were painful by themselves. These were both creatures unused to having rivals. These were two animals used to dominating all other species in their area. These were two creatures both accustomed to winning any challenge easily. But tonight, one of them was gonna have to lose. The silverback ran so fast it nearly flew at its adversary, who utilized the creature's own momentum to send it careening headlong into a tree. From the sound it made, that must have really hurt, but the silverback was not subdued. Instead, it got up and then ran off deeper into the forest. Was it running away? Or was it luring its rival deeper into the woods for some as yet unknown reason? Jenny knew her chance was now. That werewolf thing was about to chase the silverback into the forest. She took advantage of the momentary quiet and shouted Bryan's name. The immense beast stopped in its tracks. Jenny repeated the name, more questioningly this time. The monster, breathing heavily and loudly, slowly, began to turn in her direction. Jenny froze in fear. What if this wasn't Bryan? What if she had just invited this monster into her life that would have been long gone in seconds? What if this was the biggest mistake she had ever made? The creature turned, and Jenny could see him in full for the first time. Was it Bryan? She still wasn't certain. The wolf thing had a very odd expression on its face. Was that a look of recognition? It took a step toward Jenny, and she froze in fear. Everything inside her told her to run back to the house, but nothing inside her had the nerve to move a muscle. The towering dogman took a second step in her direction. It leaned down, and it smelled her. Jenny noticed its rotted breath and had to hold herself back from gagging. This was a nauseating moment, and she felt as though she were going to faint. Now, suddenly, from behind her came the voice of Laura. Jenny, get away from that thing. You there, get off my property. Leave that girl alone. Jenny looked up at the dogman as it regarded Laura expressionless, then slowly moved its massive head back down to pay attention to her. The look in its eye must have been recognition. It had to be. This must be Bryan, thought Jenny, and yet she still couldn't be certain. The creature grabbed Jenny in a sudden movement with a massive claw that completely enveloped her around her waist. Both Laura and Jenny screamed in unison as the monster flipped Jenny up in the air. Jenny saw her life pass in front of her eyes. She saw every good deed she had ever done, and she saw every bad deed as well. She suddenly had no amnesia. She regained every single memory of her entire life. But what good was it? Surely this was about to be the end of everything for her. She landed, face first, in a bunch of fur, and realized she had landed on the werewolf's back. It sped away from Laura's house, and Jenny almost slid off. She would have been free of it if she just allowed herself to continue and finish that slide. Nothing could have stopped her, not even the werewolf itself. She was in the center of his back, and he would not be able to reach around and arrest her fall in time. But Jenny didn't do that. Instead, she grabbed the fur in both hands and held on as tightly as she could. Then she and the oversized and impossible beast tore off through the forest, out of the sight of Laura, who was left standing, dumbfounded. The all-new chapter of Life with Dogman. Last time on Life with Dogman, Marsha and our hero had gone off by themselves into the night, while both sets of their parents got into a huge argument back home. Suddenly, Marsha's parents pulled up in their car, looking to take Marsha home and offering to let our protagonist come home with them to stay, since his parents were still on the warpath. We pick up the story as he tells it to us in his own words. Life with Dogman continues. I was a bit stunned by what was happening. I was being asked to move in with Marsha and her parents. While more than tempting, doing something like that would only make things worse with Mom and Dad, and then the fighting might go on forever. I hopped in the back seat with Marsha, feeling confused. After we started driving, I asked her parents to let me off at my house. They asked me if I wanted to pick up clothes and some things. I said, no, I just wanted to go home. Marsha's dad told me that my parents still felt that I shouldn't be seeing Marsha. They still wanted to ban us from communicating for the rest of the summer. They didn't believe us when we said we saw werewolf-type creatures on the property. And now that Marsha's dad had seen one of them with his own eyes, they didn't believe him either. I explained that we needed to calm my parents down, and me moving away without prior notice would certainly not accomplish that goal. They dropped me off in front of the house, and I asked Marsha to call me the next night at 8. I promised her that everything would be resolved by then. She asked, what if it isn't resolved? I told her that if it wasn't sorted out, I would walk over to her place before 8 with my stuff tied in a handkerchief at the end of a long stick. We all laughed and said goodnight. I was glad I could get them to laugh. Now I was wondering how I could do the same with my own family. I walked inside expecting to get a lecture. Surprisingly, both my parents were in bed. Is that you, killer? Dad called out from their darkened room. I could see their TV flickering. Yeah, Dad, it's me, I answered. Okay, glad you're home safe. See you in the morning. My mom chimed in. There's cake in the refrigerator. Help yourself if you want any. Fine. They were too tired to fight anymore that night. I felt that it was a good sign that we could talk things over in the morning, so I went to my bedroom and crashed. In the morning, their egos had returned somewhat, and they were acting kind of self-important again. My mother asked me what my plans were for the day, and I told her I had to work on a project for one of the neighbors, painting a room for them. She narrowed her eyes and asked me if I was really going to see that girl. I told her that girl was an old 1960s TV show, but if she meant Marsha, I wasn't planning on speaking to her again until that night. That opened the floodgates, and both of them started talking over each other, getting emotional, and ranting about all the terrible things that would happen if I kept associating with people like her. I let them tire themselves out, and when they did, I spoke as calmly as I could. Let's look at this logically, I suggested. They both protested that they were the ones being logical and I was too young to know, and so on and so forth. Again, I waited until they were done. Then I continued. You're unhappy, I reminded them, because Marsha and I both saw, or thought we saw, strange creatures in the woods at your yard party. Can we agree on that much? I asked. They both wanted to disagree, but found that they couldn't. Okay, we agree on that one thing. It's a starting point. Now, you're unhappy also with Marsha's dad because he thought he saw the same thing that I saw. Do we agree on that as well? He's humoring you, my mother snapped out. He's humoring insanity. In your opinion, I said. No, in fact, my father bellowed angrily, standing up and pounding on the kitchen table to make his point. Okay, what is your proof? I asked. My proof of what? He asked angrily. Your proof that you are stating fact and not opinion, I answered coolly. 3 of us say we saw something. You're saying we're all wrong. What is your proof? This is ridiculous, my mother hissed as she picked up my plate before I was done eating and threw it loudly in the sink. There's no such thing as werewolves. Then what did the 3 of us see? I asked. We must have seen something. Why else would we all agree that we did? Just to bother you? That confused both of them. They were angry at us, but what were we actually being accused of? Lying? If so, why would we lie? Were they accusing us of being insane and seeing things? If so, why get angry at us? Is it appropriate to be angry at someone for having mental issues? They sat there with confused expressions on their faces. You know, I told them, I've heard that anger is the other side of fear. That caught their attention, but they were still just as confused. I continued. What if the idea of something unknown that could be dangerous in the area we live in is just frightening to contemplate? I know it is for me. Isn't it natural that it would be for you as well? So again, it would only be natural for the fear to come out expressed as anger. That's why I'm not upset with you for being mad. I get it, I really do. When Marsha's dad asked me to move in with them, I told them no, because I can understand where you're coming from. He asked you to what? My mother began to look like she was going to freak out again. Yes, Mom, but I said no. I know you too well to think that you'd hold a grudge or stay angry for long. You're both too big for that. My father started laughing. I wasn't sure at what. My mother grew annoyed at his laughter and demanded to know what was so funny. Our son, he said, giving me a wink. He's going to grow up to be a politician. So the rest of the afternoon went as planned, and after taking a shower to get the paint off me, I had dinner with Mom and Dad, and things seemed a lot closer to normal again. Not quite, but almost. I went to my room afterward and waited for Marsha to call. 8 o'clock came and went. By 8:30, she still hadn't called, so I called her. I got her mom. She said Marsha was too upset to come to the phone. I asked why. She told me that she'd been chased home from the park by one of the dog-headed men. This was like a lightning bolt ran through me. Those things were getting braver and crazier. The park was in the middle of town, and so was Marsha's home. Neither of them were by the woods, which had been the natural habitat of the creatures prior to this. It seemed like they were putting themselves at risk of exposure on the one hand, and it seemed they were specifically targeting my girlfriend on the other. These were both terrible developments. I told Marsha's mom that I'd be right over. She told me it wasn't safe outside that night, and that I shouldn't worry anyway. After all, Phil had rescued Marsha, and he was there in her home, taking care of the girl right then. She told me she had set up the guest room for him so he could stay over and make sure Marsha was all right all night long. I told her in that case I was definitely coming over and slammed the phone down on the receiver as I ran out of my room. To be continued.
I'm Madeline Starr, and you can join me here each week for Saturday Night Scary Serials. That's when we tell you a new chapter in the ongoing serialized life of Jenny, whose husband Bryan turns into a large feral dogman that only she can control. Why is this happening to them? And who are the strange, partially hidden forces that seem to guide them along a path they never chose? Come back every Saturday night as I host another episode of Saturday Night Scary Serials right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel. It all begins August 31st.
Life with Dogman continues. I ran all the way to Marsha's family's home, a state of emergency blasting an alarm in my chest. Several alarms, really. First, I was upset about my girlfriend being followed by a dogman, especially so far from the forest where they lived. If those things were feeling so emboldened, it was a far worse problem than it had been before. Second, I was upset that Phil was being invited into Marsha's family the very night after they invited me in. I suppose they had taken my response to their offer as a rejection, but I wouldn't call it that. I was only responding as an adult, considering what was best for everyone involved. It seemed they expected me to behave like a kid at Christmas instead, and I found that a bad sign for a number of reasons. It also seemed to imply to me that they had invited me to stay with them, at least in part, to use me as a wedge against my parents in their petty arguments. That was disappointing. I had always felt that adults knew more than young people because they had been taught by experience. I think the only thing experience teaches some people is how to get what they want by any means necessary. That's just not how a mature person would organize their priorities, it seemed to me. If I had to play kindergarten games to keep my girlfriend, then maybe she wasn't worth keeping yet. On the other hand, this made me run faster, because if I was worth it for Marsha to keep, I should be there for her when she was upset, and I shouldn't have let Phil slither in the way I did. Acting noble is fine, but acting careless is not. I reached Marsha's hedge in front of the house and leaned on it, catching my breath and composing myself. It didn't take long, because the adrenaline in me had kicked in and I was more conscious, more alert, and more prepared than almost ever. I strode to the front door and rang the bell once, but long enough to make sure I was heard. Phil opened the door only wide enough to stick his pimply face out, and I brushed past him, Before he could tell me why I wasn't invited in, I said hi to both parents quickly, jogging past them watching TV, and up the stairs to Marsha's room before they could answer me, if they even did. I knocked on the door and she opened in a second, calling out my name questioningly. Then she hugged me and dragged me inside, pulling me down next to her on her bed. I asked her to tell me everything that happened, and she started before I finished the request. I'll try to repeat the story as verbatim as I can remember, the way she told me. I was in the park, she began, because I needed to be alone and to think. Plus, I always felt safe in that park. I could see the school I went to when I was a kid. I could see City Hall. It's sort of been the center of the world to me ever since I was really young. There's never been much crime there, since the police station overlooks the park as well. It's just always been a place that I felt safe. Just then, idiot boy Phil barged into the room without knocking. "Marsha, is he bothering you?" he asked her, trying to sound macho. Then his eyes drifted down to her hand, which was on my shoulder, and widened in surprise. "Are those my father's pajamas you're wearing?" asked Marsha. Phil stood up tall and proud. "Yes, they are. He insisted I wear them tonight." Marsha giggled. "Well, I think you two make a cute couple. Kiss him goodnight for me, sweetie." Phil stood, mouth open, for another 5 or 10 seconds before Marsha asked him nicely to please close the door when he leaves. After another 5 or 10 seconds, Phil finally understood that he had been dismissed, and he left silently. Marsha went back to her narrative. It got dark, and I think I was the last one there. I was sitting on one of those kiddie swings at that point, just lost in thought about a whole lot of things. There was a little noise on the far side of the park. It came from that thicket of trees. You know the one. I did know the one. That was a grassy park. There was only one bunch of trees, maybe 8 or a dozen of them max. It was where the bad kids went to smoke cigarettes, since the rest of the park was easily viewable from half the windows in town. According to Marsha, the trees parted, and I thought I was seeing one of those dogmen. I turned my full attention toward the trees, wanting to see what I had mistaken for one of them. There was no way one of those things could be in the safest, most open place in our town. Just absolutely no way. And yet, the harder I looked, the more certain I was that this was exactly what I was seeing. I saw it leap out of the trees and begin running toward me like some sort of Olympic sprinter. I stood up at once in alarm and stared. I should have been running, but my mind still felt that this was too absurd to run from. My body was in fight or flight mode, but my mind was in debate mode. So my mind stared and contemplated, while the rest of me panicked and ached to run home. What I saw was a man over 6 feet tall, but covered in fur and with animal legs. It had a dog head, not only in shape, but in expression and attitude too. It looked like a junkyard dog, and that I had wandered into its junkyard. That thing was not running over to get pet by me. It was at the very least intending to scare me off. Maybe it intended something even worse. Although it was running bipedally, it was kind of bent over and traveling in a way that no man could do. Its movements were graceful and savage, and it was gaining on me by the second. If it wasn't a Dogman running through the park at me. It was something else large, with fangs, running at me as fast as it could, with an angry expression on its dog-like face. Finally having no more arguments against running away, my mind sort of shut down, and I ran from that park. I did not have running shoes on, so it took me a while to get up to speed. I actually stopped and took them off, intending to run barefoot, but immediately stepped on something that hurt, and I put them right back on. I ran across the field by City Hall, and that thing ran right out in the open after me. It was not sticking to the shadows, and it seemed to have no fear of being seen whatsoever. I cut through the neighbor's backyard, the family with that pit bull. I'm friends with her, so she wagged her tail when she saw me. But I heard her growling at the dogman behind me, and that's when I began to think I might actually make it home after all. I rounded the turn onto my block and ran face first into your friend Phil, she told me. He's not my friend, I insisted. Yeah, she went on. I'm not sure why he was on my block anyway, but he was. And when I tried to run past him to my house, he tagged along, asking what was going on. When I got inside and started telling my dad what happened, he automatically assumed Phil had been there at the park with me and that we both had been chased. Actually, I'm not sure the dogman kept chasing me after my pit bull friend scared him off, or at least slowed him down. My head was spinning from that story. We had a lot to talk about, but I wasn't sure what to bring up first. And I wasn't sure what we could do about any of this either. I mean, if the dogmen in the forest are bothering you, then stay out of the forest. But if those same dogmen come out of the forest into your town and chase you right out in the open, what exactly do you do then? I looked at Marsha and was surprised to find her looking back at me. Not just looking at me, but, looking at me. And she was a lot closer than I expected her to be. Then she stopped looking in my eyes and looked at my mouth. I found myself being drawn closer to her as if by magic, or maybe by nature. Our lips were about to touch when we both heard it. There was a scratching at the window to my right and to her left. It sounded like claws tapping on glass. We both turned, and at the exact same moment, we saw. What did they see? If you stay tuned, we'll have the next chapter of Bryan's Lycan troubles. If you remember last week, Jenny had witnessed the battle between the two mammoth dogmen, the silverback one, and the one she thought, or hoped, was Bryan. Then, she had been tossed on the darker one's back as he ran off into the night, her clinging to his back. Laura was left behind with her house, which had been wrecked by the silverback. We resume the story as Jenny flies through the forest, barely hanging on for dear life, as the immense werewolf tears through the trees at speeds no human could ever muster. Bryan's Lycan troubles continue. By the time the dogman came to a rest, panting for air, Jenny found herself equally as exhausted. She slid off the great beast's back, then crumbled to her knees, trying to catch her breath. When she had the strength to look up, she could see the Lycan monster trying to get her attention. He wanted her to look at something. Rising unsteadily to her feet, she realized they were at the entrance to a cavern, or maybe a cave. Peering inside, Jenny thought she saw things glimmering. Staggering a few steps further, she saw that it wasn't an illusion. There were gold bars piled up in this cave. She rubbed her eyes and opened them again, but they were all still there. Jenny took a few steps further in and saw that the cave was filled with all sorts of valuables, all stacked haphazardly around. Utterly confused and not sure what she was seeing, she made note of each thing and added them up, trying to make sense of any of this. And then Jenny saw something that at once brought it all together and made her stomach drop at the same time. She saw that colorful backpack that had started all this trouble in the first place. The backpack with valuables inside that had gotten her arrested. The backpack that group of armed men took away from her and the police. The backpack that had caused the good cop to leave her off with his sister Laura. Panicked, Jenny backed up out of the cave and told Bryan they had to get out of there at once. She begged him to take her back to Laura's. Then she heard the sound of people approaching and she ducked back into the bushes, trying to pull the Dogman back with her. He went willingly, but bared his teeth and growled in the direction of the approaching men. Jenny shushed him and tugged on his fur until he was out of sight of the men. While they watched, the same men who had come and wrecked the police car radio and taken the backpack from her walked past into the cave. That was all she needed to see. Jenny climbed on the werewolf's back and whispered to him to take her back to Laura's. He stood and started walking back the way they had come from. Now, a walking dogman as tall as this one will walk faster than a human can, but it was still a slower trip than the journey there had been. Jenny had some time to begin to put all this together. In that moment, the night before, when she thought her life was about to end, she had experienced visions of every moment of her life. It all passed in front of her eyes. During that crisis, her amnesia had disappeared, and she knew the entire story of what had happened, and what she and Bryan had both been made to forget. Since then, it had mostly faded away like an acid dream, but she could still remember that one fact. They had been made to forget. Their amnesia was not accidental. They both knew things someone wanted them to forget. Was the amnesia induced by someone meaning them harm? Or was the amnesia meant to protect them against the dangerous information hidden in their minds? She had known the answer to that question for a brief moment the night before, but it was forgotten now. Did she already know those men? Did she already know the silverback dogman? Was he the one who had caused them to forget? And if so, why? Jenny wanted badly to tell Bryan about this, but wasn't sure what she really was thinking. I wasn't sure he would understand while still in his werewolf form. Speaking of his form, he was much larger than he had been before. This was probably the reason Jenny couldn't be certain it was him at first. He definitely was not that large a month or so earlier. Soon, they were back at Laura's, and she came outside angrily waving a stick to keep them at bay. "You keep that monster away from what's left of my home, Jenny," Laura snarled. Jenny climbed down and exhaustedly told Laura to put the stick down. Behind her, she heard a slumping thud. When she looked back, she saw that Bryan had already laid down and begun snoring. Jenny wondered what he'd been through, but she could tell it had been a lot. Laura shouted more. "I told you to get him away from here." "Well," said Jenny, "looks like you're going to have to wait till he gets his beauty rest." Jenny went inside to forage for food, and Laura stared at the werewolf sleeping on her land. Then, the creature seemed to be doing something, but she wasn't sure exactly what that something was. He was changing somehow. Laura ran inside to Jenny, telling her that the creature was doing something. He's probably changing back to human form, she answered, while eating handfuls of breakfast cereal she was pulling out of a box. He's probably what? Exclaimed Laura. Sure enough, through the kitchen window, she saw what she had only seen in movies before. A monster transforming into a man, shrinking before her eyes, shedding fur, reforming from head to toe. Who is that? She asked after a length of astonished silence. That's my husband, Jenny replied through a full mouth of cereal. Your husband? Laura was stunned. You told the police you had no next of kin. You lied to me and my brother, who is a cop. What was my option? Jenny snapped back. Tell him that I was married to a werewolf? I'd have been sent straight to the psych ward. I'd still be there now. You'd have never met me. Yeah, and my house would never have been wrecked, Laura added. That might be true, said Jenny. It's possible the silverback was here to get me. Why? Laura demanded to know. I'm honestly not sure, Jenny answered. The amnesia is blocking a lot of information to me. I'm certain now it's being imposed on us by someone or something. Laura sat down on a chair, wide-eyed and stunned. Then, a leg of the chair gave out and she dropped to the floor, never changing expression. So what do we do now? She asked Jenny. We wait till my husband wakes up, Jenny answered, and then the three of us go get your brother. Yes, my brother, Laura mumbled. Yes, we get your brother, Jenny continued, and we bring him to the cave full of gold. We bring him to the what full of what? Laura choked out. We bring him to the cave full of gold to clear my name, Jenny responded, so that I can be released into my own recognizance, so that you can get me out of your life once and for all. You do want that, don't you? More than you can ever know, Jenny, answered the older of the two women. More than you can ever possibly know. Bryan's Lycan troubles continue. Jenny and Bryan slept outside on the lawn all night, and they spent the first full hour after waking holding each other and celebrating being back in each other's arms. Eventually, Laura walked outside and stood nearby, unconcerned if she was bothering them. Jenny introduced her to her husband, Bryan, and Laura just nodded and kept staring off into the distance. It was an uncomfortable morning. All three of them were hungry, but there was no food left. There was no unbroken furniture to sit on. Having nothing to delay them, the three set out walking toward the town, silently. Their silence came not only from the unhappy situation, but also from the fact that they all knew there were very bad men in these woods, very dangerous men. It was hoped that those people would either be asleep or else far away, but if not, then they would need to be quiet enough to slip past them unnoticed. At length, Laura had a question which she asked Bryan quietly. How long, she asked, until you change again? Laura had first encountered Bryan while he was in his Lycan form. He was over 2 feet taller as a werewolf, much more unpredictable and much less intelligent. Laura did not like werewolves, and she liked Bryan in his human form only slightly better than she liked werewolves. Not till next month, answered Bryan, at least as far as I know. As far as you know, asked Laura, annoyed at the non-answer. I've got huge chunks of missing memory, he reminded her. Jenny thinks somebody did that to her. She doesn't think it's an accident. Our enemies know who we are, but all we've learned about them is that they can change into Lycans on a daily or nightly basis. Maybe I can too now. He used to change with the full moon, Jenny explained to Laura. Maybe he still does. We won't really know till the moon is out tonight, I guess. They trudged onward for some time, in silence again. Laura started meandering to her left, and Bryan whistled quietly, then nodded his head to the right. She had started heading toward the cave. The last time Jenny and Bryan had seen that cave, it was left unguarded. The chances of that ever happening again were basically non-existent. Better to head straight to the police station. And so they did, eventually arriving mid-morning. Let me do the talking, said Laura, and the tired and hungry young couple had no argument. You can do the talking, Jenny said, adding, you can do the thinking, the walking and the breathing too if you want. The trio, a total mess, walked into the station house deliberately. Laura waved to the officer at the desk and walked past him. Everyone there knew her, and nobody stopped them. They went directly to her good cop brother's desk, where he gasped and dropped a cup of water he was holding right onto his lap. You know that gang that wrecked your radio? Laura asked him without introduction. Before he could answer, she told her astonished brother to buy them some breakfast, and then they'd give him that gang's home address. At the diner in town, Mr. Good Cop was full of questions about Bryan. Who was he? Why hadn't Jenny spoken of him before? How was he tied up in all this? Laura was protective of the young pair, however, and kept redirecting the conversation back to the gold robbers. If you get credit for catching them, she looked him in the eye, you'd have a huge boost for your career, wouldn't you? He thought about it. Well, yeah, he said, but he still wasn't believing these three were going to lead him to anything but more trouble. And there's a reward? Laura continued to press him. Oh, there's a big reward for those guys, he said, as in huge, but I wouldn't get any of that. It would go to any citizen who had information leading to the arrest of. Well, that's what these kids have, Laura interrupted. They have evidence that will lead to you making the arrest of some of the most wanted people in the USA. Then you can get promoted. These two will have enough money to get out of my life, and I can go back to living my life in peace. Everyone sat around quietly, not knowing what to say or do. It seemed as though it was Laura's world, and they knew only to speak when spoken to. Is it a deal? Laura demanded to know, glaring at the three of them. They were being spoken to, so they all answered in the affirmative, too intimidated to answer any other way. After breakfast, Jenny and Laura walked to Good Cop's apartment, where they had been told they could crash on his sofa, which opened into a bed. I haven't slept on a real bed in days, said Jenny. You still aren't going to get to do that today either, responded Laura cynically. That sofa bed has a bar across the middle of it, and I'll put a pain in your back that's gonna linger. Still, Jenny looked forward to getting rest of any kind. If they didn't get there soon, she was considering curling up in a corner of the sidewalk and conking out right there. Meanwhile, Bryan and the Good Cop were trudging along through the forest toward the gold-filled cave. Bryan heard a noise and ducked down behind a tree, with the cop following him less than a second afterward. They both watched through the leaves as an armed man marched forward, apparently alone. When he was certain that the man was out of earshot, Bryan whispered, "He's heading to the cave. It's in that direction, but it might be too dangerous for us to get any closer." Good Cop looked at his GPS device and frowned. I need to get close enough that I can see it. I need to give the most accurate GPS location so that the SWAT team know exactly where to go. The further off I am from the precise spot, the messier the operation will become, and the greater risk of severe injury or worse for someone, either on our side or theirs. "Oh, can't you guesstimate?" asked Bryan. "I don't think it's safe for us to be here." "Look, kid," said the cop, "why don't you head back to my place and go take a little nappy with your girlfriend? I can handle this from here on out. Bryan rolled his eyes. All right, fine, he said. Let's get a little closer. The two marched onward slowly, quietly, carefully, keeping their eyes out to see if anyone was watching them. Bryan slipped down behind a boulder and indicated to the cop where the cave entrance was. There it is, he said. I see it, said good cop, ducking down and fiddling with his device. He typed the location numbers in and sent them off in an email to several concerned parties who had been waiting for this information. Now it's time for us to get back to town, said Laura's brother. Now it's time, said a very deep voice from behind them, for you two boys to lay belly down on the ground with your hands behind your heads. Who did that voice belong to? Were Bryan and the good cop out of luck? Would Jenny ever see Bryan again? Life with Dogman continues. Marsha looked at me, and I looked at her. She moved in toward me, and I felt like she wasn't just filling my entire vision. She was filling my heart and my entire world. Her parents had tricked me into thinking she was leaving me for Phil, but it turns out nothing could have been further from the truth. She was loyal to me, and I realized that she was the most important person in my life. It sounds corny, but I wanted to see her happy more than I wanted to be happy myself. I wanted to protect her and keep her safe, and I didn't care what it cost me to do so. I had been protecting my parents' feelings and egos, but there comes a time when a man has to prioritize his present and his future over his past. Marsha leaned in toward me, and we were about to touch lips when there came a sound at her window, a scratching or tapping sound, like the sound of claws on glass, the claws of something large. Gee, what in this neighborhood was large with claws and stood upright? My heart dropped, and I forced myself to turn and look, bracing myself before I saw. That dweeb, Phil. He was tapping his keys on the window to get Marsha's attention, that little spy. I noticed he was back in his street clothes, and he signaled and mouthed something to her that I guess meant he was going home. Fine, go. Marsha waved goodbye to him. Then he started hand signaling and mouthing something else to her, but I pulled the shade down on him before he could finish, and Marsha chuckled. I was really annoyed, and the mood had been ruined. It was our own fault, she told me, still laughing. We need to remember to pull the drapes closed from now on. From now on. I liked the sound of that. The mood had been ruined this time, that's for sure, but we would have other times to ourselves in the future. Rather than move into her home as I had been invited by her parents, I started sleeping over more to get my parents used to the idea. I got a job that week at the local comic book store and started looking into apartments that we might be able to save up for. I preferred the idea of us having our own place to me living under her parents' roof. The next weekend, her parents said they would be going away for 3 days, and they asked me to stay over at their place to look after Marsha in their absence. Obviously, they didn't have to ask twice. That Friday evening, I decided to walk over instead of taking my bike. I was a bit blissed out and probably not thinking clearly, but we hadn't seen a Dogman all week, and I kept hoping that meant they had moved on or gone into hibernation or something, or maybe that they had just gone back to their normal behavior, hunting for food in the woods instead of wandering into town to bother two humans. They seem to have long memories and spiteful personalities, but how long can a pack of dogmen hold a grudge anyway? So there I was, strolling along the street, whistling a tune. Well, okay, almost whistling a tune because I can't really whistle. And I was really looking forward to my upcoming weekend hanging out with my girlfriend. Well, you know what happened next. I saw a figure in the shadows out of the corner of my eye. That's what happened next. I wanted to believe it was one of my neighbors, but I doubted that. I had been through enough already to immediately jump to the idea that one of the dogmen was there. Hopefully only one. I turned and stared down a neighbor's driveway through the bushes and trees into their backyard. Had I imagined what I had seen? Or was there really one of those things back there? Not seeing anything else move, I picked up my pace a little. Now I was looking all around me, front, right, left, and behind. I heard a sound in the tree above me and I looked up panicked to watch a squirrel scampering around. I would have laughed, but I didn't want to stop watching and listening in every direction. I didn't want to give one of those things a chance to get close to me before I could run away. Not that I could be sure to get away anyway, though, obviously. Dogmen are fast on their hind legs and faster down on all fours. I started trying to think of some strategy. Where could I go to evade them if they ambushed me? Maybe I could try to duck under a car? I began to really wish someone would walk down the street. Anyone. At that point, I would have even been happy to see Phil. I could swear I heard someone else walking down the street in the night, but I didn't see anyone anywhere. Whoever it was, he was keeping pace with me, step for step. I stopped walking, then they stopped walking. I began to wonder, hope really, that this was just an echo. I saw a branch ahead of me on the sidewalk, and I stepped on it. So did the person pursuing me. It was an echo. This time I did chuckle, but my amusement was interrupted by what sounded like a growl from across the street. I saw nothing there, but adrenaline shot through me and I ran the rest of the way to Marsha's house. I had the keys to the front door, but I didn't want to barge in. I rang the doorbell, but took out the keys in case I got lunged at and had to get inside fast. My mind was racing, but my heart was beating even faster. I had so much to tell Marsha, to warn her about. My mind was filled with things to say. Then she opened the door, and she was all dressed up. Instantly I fell speechless, and everything I was going to say turned to mush and melted away. She smiled at me, and I felt my knees weaken. This was the most beautiful person in the world in front of me, both inside and out, and I was going to get to spend the whole weekend with her. She laughed and told me I should close my mouth before flies flew in there, and turned back inside, explaining that she was making dinner and it would be ready soon. I came inside and locked the door behind me. This was surreal. She looked like a wife from an old 1960s TV show. She was making me dinner. My own mom didn't even make me dinner. She hadn't since I was, I guess, 8 or 9, when I figured out how to work the microwave for myself to prevent starvation. I felt kind of guilty. I had been raised to never expect a woman to serve me in any way, so I offered to help in the kitchen. I got called sweet for the offer, but informed that I was not skilled enough in the culinary arts to assist her. She told me the best way to help her cook was to eat everything she put on my plate and then tell her how great it was. Sounded like a good deal for me, but of course I was still racked with guilt because that's my nature. I sat down and watched this perfect vision of a young woman doing her thing in the kitchen. She certainly did seem like she had everything timed to the last second, and I saw that I really would have been in the way. I felt like I was the luckiest guy on the planet, but was still having a hard time feeling that I had earned or deserved any of this. A weird sound distracted me. A familiar weird sound. Someone at the window. Phil again? I turned angrily, ready to tell that little peeping Phil what I thought of spies like him, when I saw that it was not Phil at the window. That window was too far off the ground outside in the driveway for it to be Phil anyway. No, it was a dark figure that had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. And it wasn't tapping on the window. It was slipping its incredibly long, remarkably sturdy-looking claws under the bottom of the window, and it was trying to lift it up. Raising my eyes from the claws, I looked through the glass into the darkness outside, and I saw them. 2 yellow, glowing eyes, which stopped looking at what they were doing and glared at me instead. I heard the sound of an immense beast growling, and I understood that it was now time to get off my butt and protect myself and the woman I loved from the impossible monster that was about to come inside the house and have its way with both of us. I rose as if in slow motion and what happened next? Life with Dogman continues. I saw the Dogman outside force his incredibly long claws under the base of the window and try to force it up. I hadn't noticed him before, but he must have been there for a while because the screen beyond the window was ripped open. I jumped out of my seat and ran to the window, locking it before the creature could pull it up. The Dogman and I locked eyes, and the thing growled at me. I want to say I never felt such fear before in my life, and my natural instinct was to pull back and run away. I thought of my girlfriend Marsha in the next room and resisted that instinct. I stared that monster right back in the eyes, unflinching. It softened its glare somewhat and pulled its claws out, making a sound not unlike a sword unsheathing. I looked down at the window and saw that the claws had left 4 marks in the underside of the wood, not too dissimilar to what would have been made by metal blades. There were little bits of sawdust around them. This monster, just a few inches away from me, was like a larger, stronger, wilder, hairier Freddy Krueger, and yet I was not going to allow myself to back down from it. Instead, the creature, after some length of time, simply turned and walked away from me toward the back of the house. I wondered if the back door was locked. I wondered if all the windows were locked as well. Racing back through the kitchen, I almost knocked a pot out of Marsha's hand. She asked me what was wrong, and I said nothing. Reaching the back door and double bolting it, I added, well, nothing out of the ordinary anyway. She asked me if I had seen one of them again, and I didn't bother to answer. I just kept checking that we were locked in, and she could answer the question herself. Should I call the police? She asked. I thought about it. Should she? The Dogman had withdrawn and walked away. If it were still trying to break in, then maybe she should have called the cops, but it hopefully had left. So I told her I thought everything was okay. I suggested we eat dinner upstairs, though. She pouted at that idea. She had gone through a lot of work to make all this for me. I said it would be more romantic, and she said, okay. I felt badly and told her it was a dumb idea. We should just have dinner like normal, and if that thing came back, maybe we should call the cops at that point. But just to be safe, I went upstairs to lock everything up and to scout out the windows and see if I could see anything unusual around her property. Upstairs, alone, and performing my due diligence, I wondered if we should call the cops after all. For me, the mood had been kind of ruined, and I was going to have trouble not being a nervous wreck through dinner anyway. Maybe having the cops out might bring a sense of closure to the incident, and also scare the Dogman back to the forest for the night. Then again, maybe they'd be emboldened as soon as the police left. Plus, if this house got known for calling the police too often, we'd all get put on the crank list and never be able to get them to respond to any real crisis ever again. All the windows were locked, and I could see nothing strange on the property, so I decided to put all ideas of Dogman out of my head and go try to have a fun time with my girlfriend, who had gone to such an effort to make a big meal for us to share. During dinner, Marsha started making conversation about the Dogman. Anyway, she asked me about the big black Dogman that had seemed to protect me back when all this began, back before she was my girlfriend. She asked me what happened to him, and I laughed. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to know what happened to a wild animal living out in the woods. Marsha suggested that he and I had a bond. She asked me if I felt that the large Dogman was gone, either moved away or passed on. I wasn't sure what the question even meant. How was I supposed to have a feeling about something I would have no way of having any information about? She was serious, though. She asked me again if I felt as though the large, dark Dogman who had seemed to save me those times was still in the vicinity, or if he had moved on in one way or another. I protested, so she asked me again. When I tried to argue my case one more time, she interrupted and asked the same question yet again, adding, "You know deep inside what the answer is. Stop talking for a minute and listen for the answer." This all seemed bonkers to me, but she was the most beautiful girl I'd ever known, and it couldn't hurt for me to try what she was asking me to try. I sat silently for a few seconds, just breathing. I allowed myself to feel all my feelings that I had been shoving to the side. What did I feel about the Dogman? I felt tense. I felt threatened. I felt uncertain. But I also felt an underlying sense that there would be some sort of happy ending to all of this. I felt protected, otherwise I would have asked her to call the police. Until I knew for certain otherwise, I felt like the big, black, furred Dogman was almost certainly still out in the woods, and so I told her that. My conscious mind immediately intervened, stressing that this was just a feeling and that feelings are not facts, and so that therefore blah 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 blah. She just smiled to herself as I went on. "We should call him," she said when I gave her a moment to interject. "We should call who?" I asked. "Your friend," she answered. "Your Dogman friend. We should let him know where we are. We should tell him that his enemies have been chasing us all the way over here, far from the woods." "And how could we tell him those things?" I asked sarcastically. "I lost his phone number in the laundry last week." She grabbed me by my shirt and pulled me over the table toward her. Then she kissed me squarely on the lips hard. A little while later, I awoke from the dream. We had been kissing over dinner for quite some time. I had no memory at all of what we had been talking about. "Wouldn't you like him to protect us?" she asked, allowing me to sit down again. "Well, sure, but you can't always get what you... Do you want me to be unsafe when you aren't around?" she asked. "Well, no, of course not, but..." "No buts," she insisted. "If I wanted butts, I'd smoke cigarettes. Do you want me safe or not? Give me a one-word answer." I answered, "Yes." She said, "Fine, then please do me a special favor. While I clean up after dinner, I want you to go take a nap in my father's chair. And I want you to just imagine how good it would feel if you knew for certain that your big, dark-haired Dogman friend were on our side while we're being messed with by these other monsters." I looked at her like she was crazy, and she burst out in giggles. "Look," she said, "if you do me that favor, I promise to do you any favor you want after you wake up from your nap." Then she winked and stood up, taking my plate from me and marching off to the kitchen, presumably to wash it. I retired to the living room and sat on the couch. I grabbed the TV remote, then remembered I had an assignment. I had to sit in her father's chair, take a nap, and I had to imagine... Wait, how did it go again? I had to feel how great it would be if that big black dog man that I hadn't seen in so long would come back and protect us. Sounded like something a little kid would do, but I had no right to complain. It wasn't like she was asking me to do hard labor or anything. Besides, how many guys have a girlfriend who asks them to nap while she cleans the house for them? Honestly, why was I protesting her ideas? It was time to start welcoming them instead. So, I leaned back in the chair, and I adjusted it till I started to feel comfortable. Then, I turned my mind to how it had felt each time I saw that immense beast. The first time I saw him, I felt intense surprise and fear. I remembered the other times. I remembered feeling threatened by the feral Dogman, and I remembered the Dark One chasing off my tormentors. I felt the intense relief of knowing, or at least suspecting, that it had acted to rescue me. I also remember the doubt in my mind. It might have chased the other one off for its own reasons. Maybe I had witnessed a turf battle. Maybe they were longtime enemies and it had nothing at all to do with me. No, I knew deep down that I had been looked out for on that day. I remembered how good that felt. I also remembered how much larger that creature was than the feral ones. They ran from him like cats running from a dog, or mice running from a cat. There weren't any of those feral dogmen that could take the large black one in a fight. Feeling entirely through myself that I was safe and protected, I remember wanting the allied dogman to understand how deeply we could use his protection. I remembered wanting him to feel how important Marsha was to me, and to understand that protecting her was the same as protecting me. It wasn't like I was imagining speaking to him. It was just like I was trying to literally share my feelings with him. If we actually had some kind of connection, as Marsha suggested, that I wanted to use that connection to communicate that to him. Satisfied that I had accomplished my task, I opened my eyes, intending to go to the kitchen and tell Marsha of my internal experience. But as my eyes opened, I looked out the window directly in front of me, and I saw yellow, glowing eyes staring back at me. The yellow, glowing eyes of not my friend, but the same angry, feral dogman which had been trying to break in earlier. When it saw me looking back, it bared its fangs at me and appeared to become enraged. "Marsha, honey," I called out to the kitchen. I think maybe now might be a good time to call the police. To find out what happened then, come back next Saturday for the following chapter of Life with Dogman on Saturday Night Scary Serials. We'll be right back with the latest chapter of Bryan's Lycan troubles right after this very important message. And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend, we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story. And now, Bryan's Lycan troubles continue. Bryan's head swam with visions of men, dangerous men. He had to fight back against them, but how? Then the men became smaller and smaller. Or was he growing larger? Soon, he heard incongruous sounds, domestic sounds, indoor sounds. There was no conflict in what he was hearing to match what he was seeing. Which was real, the battle or the conversation sounds? He realized he was dreaming, but didn't know which was the reality. He tried to open his eyes, but he saw the forest in front of him. It sounded like he was inside, though. How could that be? He tried again to open his eyes and saw much brighter light than the forest before his eyes flickered shut again into the darkness. "He's waking up," said a male voice in his ears. "Let me talk to him first," said a female voice. No, not just a female voice. That was Jenny's voice. His body woke up, and he could flutter his eyes open finally. It was Jenny after all, but he didn't know where they were. Sitting up with a start, Bryan looked around. There was Jenny. There was Laura. And there was Laura's good cop brother. But still, Bryan had no idea where the four of them were. What? Where? Bryan tried to form words. "He doesn't remember what happened," said Jenny to good cop. "Let me determine for myself what he remembers," grouched the officer, and he replaced Jenny in front of Bryan. "What's the last thing you remember, Bryan?" asked the cop. Bryan had to think about it. He remembered his dream. What happened before that? I was in the forest," he said, still confused. "Oh, I was with you," he said at last. "That's right, Bryan," said the cop. "We went into the forest together. Do you remember why?" Bryan was still waking up, still searching his memory. Then he gasped. "We were captured," he shouted at last. "Those men. Now I remember. I showed you the cave so we could get the reward money. But before we could get away, we got captured by the men I was trying to help you capture." "Well, they almost caught us," said the cop. "Is that all you can remember?" Bryan thought for a while, then he had to admit his next memories were that dream. He asked the cop to fill in the blanks for him. "Well," began good cop, "you became very agitated when they tied us up." He studied Bryan's reaction, but he was a blank slate, waiting to be filled in. Good cop went on. "They told you to stop fidgeting, but you only got worse. They were about to do something very bad to you when I told them you were having a seizure and that it would be over soon. I told them to ignore you, and for some reason, they basically did. I guess they figured they had bigger problems. They wanted to know if I had alerted anyone to their presence. I said no, and now they were busy looking at my phone. The email app I used to alert the SWAT team of their location was hidden. So at first all they were reading were my texts to my girlfriend. "You have a girlfriend?" shouted Laura in surprise. "I forgot," the cop said to his sister. "You don't use Failbook." "Why would anyone use that app?" asked Laura, incredulous that the human race was so self-destructive. Good Cop continued his narration, watching Bryan's eyes to see if anything seemed familiar to him. "So, Bryan, while I was trying to think how to get out of my bonds, you literally burst free of yours." "I what?" asked Bryan. "Well, let's say you outgrew them," added the cop with a wink. "Oh no," said Bryan, looking at Jenny. "This means you won't only transform with the full moon anymore," she finished his sentence. "But it was stress that changed you," she added. "So we can control this, Bryan." Bryan listened dejectedly as the cop described what he saw happen. Bryan enlarged and enlarged until his rope snapped like rubber bands and flew off him. Then the cop witnessed an 8 or 9 foot tall, hairy, dog-headed humanoid replace Bryan in front of his eyes. The bad men used their weapons and could have taken him down if he had only been an elephant or a bear. But Bryan hadn't become either of those types of animals. Bryan had become a Lycan, and so nothing the men did seemed to have the slightest effect on him. There was some battling with the men, and Bryan began to understand his dream a little better. Apparently, he threw them around like they were toys, and they gave up and started to run away when the SWAT team arrived. "Next you picked me up," said the cop, "and I saw my life flash in front of my eyes. I thought you were going to hurl me and end it all for me, but you didn't. You tossed me on your back, and we ran away. Or you ran away and I hung on for dear life." I could hear the SWAT team sweeping up the situation loudly behind us, and I made no effort to stop you from running. When we reached a local road, you passed out and returned to this form. I called for backup and got us driven here. "Where is here?" asked Bryan finally. "It's his apartment, Bryan," Jenny told him. "He protected your secret. Nobody knows what happened except for the bad guys, and nobody's going to believe them when they start talking about werewolves." "So, the reward money," Bryan lit up. "I showed you where the thieves were. Do I get the reward money?" "It'll take a few days," said Good Cop, "but yeah." "We want to give it to Laura," said Jenny, drawing a surprised look from all 3 of the other people in the room. "Her house got wrecked because of us, Bryan, and we owe it to her." "I'd be happy," said Laura, "if you used the money to go far, far away from me and never come back." "We'll do that for free," said Jenny, "but we have to do the honorable and the right thing by you before we go." There was silence in the room for a while, broken finally by Laura muttering something to the effect that they could split the money when it came in. "We don't have to think about that right now," said Good Cop, "but we do have to think of what the official story is going to be about what happened. First of all, werewolves are not real, and second of all, I was not just rescued by one. So, what exactly did just happen? We all need to be on the same page about this." Everyone quieted down and thought everything through. There was such silence in the room that when the doorbell rang, they all jumped. "Who is it?" called out the cop. "It's Sergeant Rienko," came the reply. "Open up. We need to get your statement about what just happened today." What will his official statement be? Bryan's Lycan troubles continue. "Your knee is giving me a kidney punch," whispered Bryan to Jenny. "Sorry," said Jenny, repositioning herself in the tiny hall closet. Apparently, Mr. Good Cop had no other rooms with doors on them in his small apartment except the bathroom and this closet, so he had shoved the two of them in there before answering the door to his apartment. His sergeant was there asking the Good Cop questions about what had happened earlier in the woods before he had gone over with the two of them what their official story would be. If they each gave different answers, who knows what kind of drama might ensue. So Bryan and Jenny had to hide in the hall closet and just wait, hoping that the cops would finish their business sooner rather than later. Bryan was losing his patience with the entire experience, though. When Good Cop finally let them out, Bryan wanted to go for a walk. He wanted to be anywhere but where they were. Good Cop told him what he had told his superior, and Jenny repeated it back to him. She had remembered every word. Bryan, on the other hand, had been unable to pay attention at all. He just wanted out. "Come on, Jenny, let's go for a walk. Let's go to a diner or something," Bryan whined. "I'd rather you two didn't," Good Cop told them. "I don't really want you having too much of a presence around town. I don't want you to be any more recognizable than you absolutely need to be. I want to get you your reward money, and then I want you to move on." "Well, give us a lift to another town then," Jenny suggested. "Bryan and I need a break from all this stress." Good Cop and his sister Laura gave each other a glance. It was a fair request. "I know a cheap hotel with a decent restaurant in it," she said, more to her brother than anyone else. She named the location, but neither Bryan nor Jenny had ever heard of it. Good Cop liked the idea. They could get some space. They could be in a location where nobody would think to look for them, but he would know where they were when he needed them. Sounded like a good deal. He gave Laura the keys to his car, and the three of them took the stairs down, leaving through the back door of the apartment building. Dropping them off, Laura gave them a piece of paper with a list of phone numbers to reach her and her brother, then bid them a good night. The hotel was more of a motel, but the restaurant looked clean. They checked in, then went to get something to eat. The waitress sat them in seats right next to a large window, looking out on the forest. The sky was turning from dusk to night, and the scene was peaceful. Bryan was happy. He finally could relax and spend some time with his wife, not having to worry about anything for a little while. No monsters, no smugglers, no transformations into a Lycan, no cops, just a hamburger, a decaffeinated soda, then back to their room to chill out. Jenny, on the other hand, was pensive. Bryan could tell she was acting weird but couldn't place what the problem was, so he asked her outright what was going on. Jenny told him she was feeling déjà vu. She knew she had never been in that restaurant before, but still, she was having the strangest feeling of déjà vu somehow. She said the window they were sitting by was making her uncomfortable. "Well, let's get another seat," Bryan suggested. "Or let's get our food to go and eat it in our room. It doesn't matter to me." No, it's fine," Jenny told him. "It's just an odd feeling. I don't know where it came from, but I'm sure it'll go away." So they were brought their food, but Jenny wasn't very talkative as they ate. Bryan watched the TV over Jenny's shoulder, which had its sound turned off. Somebody playing sports ball of some sort up there. Bryan didn't recognize the teams. He wondered if it was just because they were in a strange location, or if the memory of the teams was wiped out with the rest of his memories, such as marrying Jenny, for instance. He knew she was his wife, he had no doubt of that, but he didn't really remember much more than that about either one of them. So maybe Jenny had been to this restaurant before but just couldn't remember. It might explain her feeling of déjà vu. The waitress came to take their plates and asked if everything was okay. They both looked at her, turned away from the big window next to them, and conversed for a while. The conversation was interrupted by the waitress looking outside and screaming. Leaping to their feet and looking out the window, Bryan and Jenny, at the same time, saw a large, muscular, humanoid, entirely covered in gray matted fur, run up to the window and press his dog-shaped, snarling head against the glass. Even on this side, they could hear the creature growl. To find out what happened then, you'll need to come back next for the following episode of Bryan's Lycan Troubles on Saturday Night Scary Serials. Hope to see you then.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.